Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Fen called Winter. You know, at some point I'm just going to admit that I'm not sure where to look when it comes to finding consistent black metal recommendations, for at least the stuff I like. I mean, I try to keep my ear to the ground, but for multiple years in a row now, it feels like whenever I find a record that's more on the atmospheric side of the genre, it's damn near a miracle that I found in the first place, and thus wind up covering a lot less of this genre than I would otherwise like. But in this case, it looks like I'm not quite as behind as I was expecting, and I was a little bit stunned how many Patreon votes this got once I added it to the schedule, so let's talk about Fen. They're an English black metal act that started in the mid-2000s, straddling the line with progressive metal and post-rock, and drawing more than a little comparisons to Wolves in the Throne Room or Agalloch. They played to the more nakedly melancholic side of the spectrum in comparison with the soaring power of acts like Seor and Panopticon. They're a little bit more moody and bleak, but of course there's different shades of that. Some of that gets these thicker, muddier textures that seethe off of the subtle rumblings of bass guitar, where on latter cuts on records like Carrion Skies, they get a little bit more ethereal and spacious, looking to pull the listener deeper into that seething, grimy darkness. Now that's not saying that it's all atmospherics. Fen is certainly capable of ramping up the blast beats and the tremolo riffs, but in revisiting their back catalog, I did find myself wishing a little that they would crank up the texture or intensity a little bit to match the frontman's very distinctive howling voice. Maybe push the dynamics a little bit harder. Still, that's nipping across four pretty distinct and pretty excellent records, taking an established compositional structure and refining and expanding it with every single release. And considering their production has only gotten sharper and more depth into it, and I was in the mood for some black metal comfortable pushing into new territory, I decided to check out their newest record, Winter. And yeah, I know I'm a little bit late to the party, but hey, I just found this. So how is it? Well, it looks like we're starting early this year with absolutely killer atmospheric black metal records because Fen delivered again with Winter. In fact, I'll go further. While this album does mostly stick with the established atmospheric black metal sound that Fen has brought to the table before, the more listens I gave this, it shows a record that's more diverse, more furious, more textured, and more progressive than I think they've ever delivered in the past. Likely on par with some of their best work, and certainly one of the best albums I've heard thus far in 2017. Yeah, it is that good. And what I find thrilling is that of the black metal records that I've loved since I started my exploration of the genre a couple years back, they've all showcased a different sound and progression. Panopticon was transcendent and meditative in its epic sweep and fury. Seor fused its soaring power with tremendous Celtic melodies that I love to this day. And Fen, well, if you've been looking for a record that still seethes with the best of them, while bringing elements of post-rock, progressive metal, and even elements of thrash and doom metal, yeah, definitely deliver. It's a kick-ass record too. And I want to start off because I really want to talk about the production and instrumentation here. With this record, we have 6 songs, each over comfortably 10 minutes to give Fen's longest album to date, and thus to keep each of these songs diverse and interesting enough with well-executed transitions and swell. That's almost a Herculean task. That's a lot of material they gotta fill up for over an hour. And for a bit, I was worried that Fen would default to a comfortable formula on the opening track Pathway. I dug the build-up to the thicker groove in the drums against the rattling tremolo picking in the distance, especially courtesy of a thicker, more grimy bass groove. But as the song ebbed back about midway through, I was thinking that this album would default to Fen's typical ebb and flow. And then the groove switched and locked into a much thicker, heavier, fuzzier mix, and I realized I was in for a much more diverse ride than I was expecting. And that's one of the things I really love about this album. You're gonna get your blast beats and your furious tremolo riffs and all manner of depth and hollowness that really hammers on that melancholy so effectively, but then the band will switch things up with remarkable precision and timing. The syncopated progression of the drums and that bass guitar that breaks up the guitar melody on Penance, before the frankly ridiculous bass solo and twisted interlocking riffs. The bass guitar really needs a lot more credit for what it does to the grooves on this album, or how the guitars and drums blur together on Fear before a major chord shift for the final solo that I really thought was great. The heavier weight and thicker chop of the groove on Internment that feels part doom metal, part thrash, that ends on a tremendous melancholic solo. The phenomenal balance of the post-rock melody and pummeling riff on Death, and then on Sight, before the flattened roar, the blast beats explodes back, especially in the furious kick drum progression. The opening post-rock segment is borderline ambient with what sounds like a hint of a guitar tone tuned to sound like a saxophone. It really is kind of beautiful. You know, almost at a little bit of a loss to describe issues with this production. The layers are so well balanced, the grooves have such grimy, wiry muscle, the transitions are so well handled, and across the runtime, it never feels like it's wasting the audience's time. And that's saying a lot for songs this long. It's black metal that feels as grim and gruesome and heavy as its content and writing, but also knows enough to explode and really soar, especially in the finale moments. All these songs end really well, and the writing. By the Nine Hells, I don't normally comment much on black metal lyrics, but I need to give props to the poetry on display here. For one, there's a story that's actually being told with this album. A mysterious protagonist struggles through a wasteland fen filled with corpses to confront a desiccated stone cathedral, where a single statue that remains undefiled sears into his soul in the waste and failures of his life. And thus, after leaving, he falls to die in agonizingly slow fashion in the swamp, returning to the frozen earth from whence he came in order to set his soul free from corrupted, ruined flesh, that it might soar beyond human comprehension of time and space. So yeah, if you want to boil it down to the basics, it's very much the story of someone, or something, dying in slow motion in a corpse-filled swamp in the shadow of an abandoned church. But you know what? It's the details that give it real weight and power for me. The poetry is rife with details of flesh and blood, macabre in its details, but always seeming to highlight how the rotting consumption of time will be transcended. Mortal bodies returning to be consumed and give back to the earth for greater renewal. That rot leads forth to new life. Death, it's always inevitable on this album, but it's making peace with it, which what it means for that condemned soul. That's what matters. Acceptance of that endpoint as the consciousness departs from this universe. And again, I'm not doing justice to the language and the poetry here. It's visceral and plenty graphic on some of these songs, but never to directly shock the audience. Clinical in its twisted detail, but with a flow and a precision that captures something primal without feeling base. It really is something stunning. Honestly, what about this record doesn't work? Well, I'm struggling to pick out a weak track outside of slightly weaker moments on a few songs, but there are a few. Probably Internment and Death could have afforded to switch up their more frenetic black metal segments a little bit more, add a little bit more melody to the upper end, make it a little bit more distinctive, as some of the lead guitar lines, especially in the upper end, can feel a little underserved. And as for as much as I like the vocals from our frontman and the impressive ability to switch from guttural growls to full-fledged screaming to even more progressive, clean singing, I do think there could have afforded to be a little bit more consistency in the vocal arrangements. Sometimes there can be transitions from one style to the other without a lot of warning, and it doesn't always flatter the flow of the song, which is otherwise impeccable. And while, unsurprisingly, I'm a little bit more forgiving of the clean vocals than most, I do think they could have been sung in a slightly lower register in order to better match the grinding snarl of the bass grooves and the riffs on this album. But beyond that, again, this is one hell of a black metal project. Fearlessly diverse and progressive without losing its organic swell and power. Amazingly well produced in its layering and transitions, and the writing that really does showcase a level of beauty in decay I haven't heard on a metal project in years. In other words, 9 out of 10 for me, the highest of my recommendations. Folks, I know that black metal is not for everyone, and this more so than most, given how thunderously visceral it can get. But if you're a fan, you definitely need to hear this album yesterday. It's definitely a Blizzard maelstrom that's worth braving, even if it's going to get dark at that very end. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know black metal's not for everyone, but I really love this album. It does some twisted things, but the melodies are so good, and the textures on this album so visceral, so potent. I really loved it. So yeah, link to buy the record is in the description below, and buy this. You want to support metal that's this good. And I got the sample and the pull up there. I'm curious where more hardcore black metal fans fall on this, because I thought it really had a lot of thunderous power, and I like to think that a lot of people fall on that same note. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And any people who want to get more involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, or possibly more. And once a week on Saturdays, the higher Patreon contributors get to vote for records to move up my schedule. I think I've settled into a pretty decent groove with that, and hell, I want to hear more from you guys. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.